Greetings, friends. Thank you for joining us. We'll give folks just another minute to settle in before we begin, probably transitioning from another virtual meeting or call, grabbing some water. We're glad that you're able to join us today, and we're looking forward to our conversation. My name is Carlos Medina, pronouns he, him, his, and I am the Learning Services Manager at Catalyst of San Diego and Imperial Counties. And I'm happy to welcome you to Advocacy 101. And I invite you all to introduce yourselves in the chat. And we'll begin shortly. And just a few opening housekeeping components before we kick things off. 4 quick updates. Number 1, the session is being recorded and you will receive a link to the recording afterwards so you can check it out later. Number 2, we'll have an opening poll before we get things off, just to kind of do a pulse check of advocacy and folks' experience in the room. Number 3, there is a Q&A portion later on in today's program, but by all means, you're welcome to drop in any questions that arise in the chat box, and we'll be sure to interweave those into today's conversation. And last but not least, at the end of today's program, there'll be a brief 4-question evaluation poll, and I just want to thank you now for taking a brief moment to complete that poll because your data is critical to helping us improve future programs. So today we're going to explore advocacy as a powerful tool available to you and your investees. Simply put, advocacy can leverage the impact of available funds so you can stretch grant dollars and see more far-reaching results. In fact, the National Committee on Responsive Philanthropy report documented a $115 to $1 return on investment for public policy grant making. And so between dramatic changes in federal immigration policy, state rules for housing and transportation, and local criminal justice advocacy, there's plenty to lean into. And so leading today's discussion, we have Rhiannon McAfee, public policy consultant at Catalyst, as well as Mark Tran, program associate at the California Endowment and Public Policy and Advocacy Committee member at Catalyst. And then also joining us today, well, actually, we'll do a brief introduction of a few more folks joining us later, but without further ado, before we jump into the program, we're gonna just put up a quick poll for the folks in the room. And the poll is just asking, how much advocacy do you fund? And if the answer is, I don't know, that's absolutely okay. Just take a few minutes for folks to fill it out. Three more responses and we'll get across the finish line. We'll go ahead and we'll share this data with folks now and then share results. You should see those available to you on your screen. And do folks have those available? If I can get a thumbs up. Awesome. Well, without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Rhiannon to put these poll findings in the context and to kick off today's conversation.
Cool. Thank you very much, Carlos. Once again, my name is Rhiannon McAfee. I'm the public policy consultant for Catalyst of the San Diego and Imperial Counties. My pronouns are she, her. And the poll was not altogether unsurprising. It looked like 75% of the respondents weren't sure how much advocacy they funded, if any at all, which is not unsurprising. Advocacy is a very iffy topic with philanthropy, and part of it is a large sort of misunderstanding or misconception or confusion over what advocacy is, how much can we do, what can we do. And 3 of the biggest barriers I think I hear when it comes to philanthropy participating in advocacy is we can't do it or don't know it's legal. How do we know if it's effective? And well, we shouldn't be getting involved in politics. So the first, the legalities of it and what you can and can't do, we'll go into a little bit more later. But I wanted to start off just sort of addressing kind of the other two issues. And it is true that advocacy effectiveness can be very difficult to quantify. How do you know what effect a single organization had on a policy or the effect that policy is going to have once it's enacted? And the report that Carlos mentioned earlier that showed that advocacy, it was a 3-year study of nonprofit advocacy, the investment of $115 for every one, or payout of $115 for every $1 invested. So I kind of wanted to go over what that actually means, because the number would actually be much higher if you take into consideration the advocacy that doesn't have a dollar amount attached to it. Because when we're talking about those dollar amounts, what we're really talking about is advocacy that has a specific effect on a policy that either increased government spending, saved the government money, or streamlined programs, increased revenue for programs, or increased money going directly into the pockets of disenfranchised communities, such as raising the minimum wage. Whereas many policy outcomes don't necessarily have a clear-cut dollar amount attached to them, or the dollars created or saved are not going to become apparent for some time. I think in terms of increasing access to healthcare or voting, restorative justice policies, or racial equity. There's not necessarily a dollar amount attached to those. But the kind of bottom line when it comes to the idea of effectiveness and why should we get involved is nonprofits exist to address a problem. They're funded by foundations that care about that problem and believe that that specific nonprofit has good programs that do address that problem. The bottom line is that nonprofits simply cannot do it alone. Example I like to give is Feeding America. It's a nationwide organization of food banks. The problem they exist to address is food insecurity. And they serve millions and millions of meals every day all across this country, addressing hunger in this country. They also have an extremely active advocacy and policy arm. And why is that? Well, one reason is that because for every single meal that they serve, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, the federal government program that provides meals to underprivileged people, serves 9 meals. So that's for every 1 meal they serve, SNAP serves 9. And not everyone who is food insecure actually qualifies for SNAP. So their policy and advocacy arm spends a great deal of time consistently and constantly advocating for the SNAP program not to be cut, to increase funding for SNAP, to increase eligibility for SNAP. Because if SNAP disappeared, Feeding America and their food banks would not be able to cover that gap. And the more funding that goes into SNAP and the more access there is to SNAP, the more Feeding America can do for the people who don't qualify for SNAP or can't get to SNAP. So you're also talking about food insecurity, which is really a symptom of a much larger problem involving homelessness and poverty. And so when you're talking about organizations like Feeding America or food banks staying in their lanes can get much bigger when you start looking at what are the underlying issues that cause food insecurity. There's a new report out on philanthropy in the 2020 census, and we'll send that to you afterwards, but it really demonstrates the absolute power of incorporating policy into an overall plan of action. Over the last few years, of the $118 million in philanthropic funds nationwide going to the census, 15.5% of them went to policy. There was an immediate understanding that ensuring fair representation and an equitable count would mean having to respond to policies that might make it more difficult to count underrepresented populations and ensure that funding wasn't cut from the census. So funders were working together by funding advocacy and participating in it, sending off joint letters and submitting federal comments, and weighing in on the issues that would make it more difficult for the programs that they funded to do their jobs. One of the biggest things that they did was weighing in on the citizenship question. Now, philanthropy could have stayed in its lane and focused solely on census education and outreach, but the effect of the philanthropic involvement on the policy side effectively led to the funds they invested on outreach and education more powerful. So when it comes to advocacy, what you're really looking at is being able to leverage the power of advocacy to make the programs you fund more effective. Because change making doesn't stop at the end of a grant cycle, and policy is about creating those long-term solutions. And the vast majority of the programs, like hunger and food insecurity, they take a mix of funding, programs, and policy solutions, and they need all three. And there's many different roles you can play. You can fund, convene, engage in advocacy yourself, and you can do a lot of power building as well. And I'm going to hand it off to Mark for a few minutes to talk a little bit about what change making and power building looks like for the California Endowment. So Mark, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you, Rhiannon. Good morning, everybody. Mark Tran, Program Associate with the California Endowment, based here in San Diego. Been with the Endowment for close to 6 years now. And I've been part of the Catalyst Public Policy Committee for going on 2+ years. I guess I'm doing something right because they haven't asked me to leave yet. But again, thank you, Carlos and Catalyst, for the opportunity to be here today. For the California Endowment, it begins and ends with people power. Our charitable purposes and mission statements provide the legal framework for TC's long-term commitment to improving California's health status and access to healthcare. You know, advocacy is part of that overarching goal of systems and policy change that we've been trying to impact. As we wrap up our 10-year place-based initiative called Building Healthy Communities, where we funded $1 billion over 14 communities throughout the state of California, we've taken a more strategic view and have begun looking at power building ecosystems throughout the communities and now the regions and sub-regions that we look to fund in. Within a healthy power building ecosystem, where organizing and base building are at the center of a flower, or what we call the power flower, you have advocacy and policy as one of those petals that makes up the power flower. Along with other petals such as research and legal, alliance and coalitions, organizational development and infrastructure, along with communications, cultural and narrative change, you need all these pieces within a healthy ecosystem to be vibrant. And advocacy feeds into the organizing and base building and are central for historically excluded adults and youth to have power, agency, and voice. Yet alone, without all the petals supporting the center, the base building and organizing are insufficient to gain influence over the decision makers. Thus requiring an ecosystem of capacities tailored to achieve an inclusive democracy and to close health equity gaps. But in order for advocacy to be able to happen, there are important foundational blocks that need to be invested in, such as community outreach and engagement, education, and leadership development. Again, it's the investment in people that builds strength, that builds and strengthens people power. And so for us, you know, advocacy, again, is just one piece of that. It's a lot to expect our partners to stand before a decision maker, to provide a testimony, or to advocate for changes within their community. So I think there's a lot of relationship building, support, and guidance that needs to be provided to our partners who stand to gain the most and lose the most with the policies that have been prescribed and written and have historically excluded and really harmed the communities that they come from. And again, with that, you know, I mean, it's, for me, I can't say it enough. It's really the investment in people that really builds and strengthens people power. So I'll turn it back to Rhiannon.
Thank you for that, Mark. So we're going to get a little bit into the nitty gritty now of what foundations can and can't do when it comes to funding advocacy and lobbying, and also participating in advocacy and lobbying themselves. And I think one of the, like I said earlier, biggest barriers is many foundations, particularly private foundations, have the notion that they cannot participate in advocacy. And so I wanted to really start off today by distinguishing between advocacy and lobbying, because what private foundations cannot do and what there are limits on for public foundations is lobbying, not advocacy. And they are two very, very, very different things, in which lobbying is a form of advocacy, but not all advocacy is lobbying. So to give you a really clear idea of what lobbying is, because it's very, very specific, there's two kinds of lobbying. direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying. So direct lobbying is what we tend to think of when it comes to lobbying, and it has 4 very specific parts. Direct lobbying is communication with a legislator that expresses a view about specific legislation. In order for it to be direct lobbying, it has to do all 4 of those things. So for instance, if you went into a legislator's office to have a conversation about reducing greenhouse gases and climate change, that is not necessarily lobbying. It is communication. It is with a legislator. It's expressing a view you want to reduce greenhouse gases. If you don't mention or talk about a specific piece of legislation, it's not lobbying, it's just education. Another example, if you were to actually support a piece of legislation or oppose a piece of legislation and put out a statement on your website saying that your organization is in support of AB 12, I'm making up a piece of legislation, because of X, Y, and Z reasons. That is also not direct lobbying. It's communication. It expresses a view about a specific piece of legislation. It was not a communication with a legislator. So in order for it to be lobbying, all 4, or direct lobbying, all 4 of those things have to happen. Now, the second kind of lobbying is grassroots lobbying, which, if we take the example again of you putting out a statement on your website in support of a particular piece of legislation, grassroots lobbying is communication with the public that expresses a view about a specific piece of legislation and includes a call to action. So in that example of you putting a statement on your website that you support AB 12 because of X, Y, and Z, that in and of itself is also not grassroots lobbying. It does not become grassroots lobbying until somewhere in that statement or at the end of that statement, you say, we encourage you to call your legislator and tell them you support this piece of legislation. Here are your legislators' information for you to call and tell them what you think. If it doesn't have that call to action, it's not lobbying. And private foundations can engage in any kind of advocacy activity except for campaign intervention and lobbying, including direct and grassroots lobbying. So if it's not falling under the definition of lobbying, you can meet with your elected officials. You can talk to your elected officials about the issues that are important to you. And you can even support and oppose legislation and tell people that you support and oppose legislation, as long as it doesn't fall under those 2 very, very, very specific definitions. You can also, as a private foundation, support public charities that engage in lobbying. You can give general support grants to them as long as you're not earmarking funds for lobbying. And you can give special project grants to organizations for projects that include lobbying, as long as that grant amount that you were giving does not exceed the amount they're spending on non-lobbying. And when it goes to public foundations have other different rules where you can engage in lobbying. If you take the 501h election, which there's 2 ways to engage in lobbying, and the 501h election is the best kind because you can spend up to 20% of your annual budget on lobbying. And again, you can make general support grants and project grants with which the grantee can lobby. So lobbying is not out of bounds, definitely for public foundations. And for private foundations, you do not have to put restrictive statements in your grant agreements saying that your grantees cannot lobby. It's unnecessarily restrictive and it's not legally necessary. So with that, I wanted to open it up for any discussion or questions burning questions people specifically have about the definitions of lobbying, what kind of advocacy they can participate in, or any specific issues that they've run into in their thinking about advocacy or participating or funding advocacy.
So Rihanna, we have a question in the chat. And
hold on, let me look and see what it is. Oh, there it is. Can funders support 501c4 organizations that engage in lobbying? So private and public foundations can support C4 organizations when their activities advance the foundation's mission. For public foundations, that grant would count against the foundation's lobbying limit. And again, like all things, those funds can't be used to support or oppose candidates. And for private foundations, they can support any of those 501c4 activities that a 501c3 could also undertake, except lobbying and voter registration. So yes, they absolutely can support 501c4 orgs that engage in lobbying. It just requires the same rules as before when it comes to lobbying.
Thank you, Rhiannon. Here's a question I've got. Aren't foundations required to prohibit grantees from using its grants to lobby?
Oh, absolutely not. No, private foundations can absolutely support public charities that conduct lobbying through general support grants and even specific project grants. There's absolutely no restriction except for those specific project grants. You cannot grant them more money than they're going to spend on the non-lobbying activities.
So to tack onto that, Rhiannon, so the portion of that grant that goes towards lobbying activities, whether it's 10% or 25%, for tax purposes, does that mean that the foundation can't claim it as a tax exempt contribution?
Are you talking about it's a private or public foundation?
Either.
Okay, so I'm not a tax expert, so that I would have to check in with. I can write that question down and get that answer to you. I mean, it basically for a public foundation, it would, if you're giving funds that are used for lobbying, it would count against your lobbying expenditure amount for the year.
Okay, thank you.
So Rhiannon, I've got another question. Hypothetically, as a funder, if you're interested in funding lobbying work, or you're interested in a potential partner that might dabble in that, would it be appropriate for the foundation to ask those questions, or is it generally the funded partners approaching funders to see? And what would you recommend in terms of maybe best practices, or how can we break the ice to have those conversations?
That is a great question. Absolutely, foundations can express a desire to fund advocacy when they're putting out RFPs or applications or any type of reports. I would encourage foundations to do so if they are interested in advocacy. I would be a little bit careful, depending on whether you are a private foundation or a public foundation, putting out a call for an interest in organizations that do lobbying, because as a private foundation, that may seem like you're attempting to earmark funds for lobbying. But definitely private foundations and public foundations can express an interest in, we want to fund advocacy. And I think it's a great conversation to have with all of your grantees, current and future, as to whether they do engage in advocacy and if they're interested in engaging in advocacy, because one of the reasons that many nonprofits don't do advocacy is because they don't have the funding, because no one's interested in funding it. So bringing up those conversations about advocacy to normalize it, and you may find a lot of your grantees want to do advocacy and just don't have the funding.
So Rhiannon, I'm sorry, I had some technical difficulties earlier on, so I was cutting in and out.
No worries.
So you were talking about direct lobbying, grassroots lobbying. Can I kind of just, would it be fair to say that essentially it's considered lobbying if there's some sort of outreach or call to outreach to a legislature?
To an extent, only if it is about a specific piece of legislation. So you can meet with your legislator every day of the week if you just really want to talk about climate change with them, or you really want to talk about food insecurity or any other issue that you care about. Unless it is attached to a specific piece of legislation, it's not lobbying, it's just education. You do have to be a little bit careful because some people can get very close to the line. If there is a very, very large, important piece of legislation that's in the news and everybody knows about, and you start making appointments with your legislators to talk about that issue and are saying the exact same things about, that are in that specific bill, then you're treading on the edge a little bit. But generally, unless it's about a specific piece of legislation, it's not lobbying, it's advocacy and education.
All right, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
And it looks like we have another question in the chat, Rhiannon.
Oh, need to maximize that. I think I heard you say foundations can't fund voter signups. Did I hear that right? Can foundations support any type of election related activities? Oh, yes, please. Please support election related activities. There are very specific rules on voter registration activities, but voter contact and voter engagement is absolutely allowed. The really big restriction on election related activities is that you cannot support or oppose a specific candidate. But get out the vote drives and encouraging voting and voter education is all a go. And we really encourage philanthropy and foundations to support voter engagement efforts because it's hugely important. The rules on voter registration, I would have to go back to my notes that I don't have in front of me because they're a little bit complicated and fairly specific as to how much voter registration you can support and how many states you have to do it in order for it to be allowed. But in terms of voter engagement, absolutely. You can also get involved in ballot initiatives as well. Again, there's very specific, somewhat complicated rules about that, but ballot measures are not considered in the same way that candidates are. Ballot measures are actually fall under lobbying rules because a ballot measure is not a person, it is a piece of legislation, and you are lobbying the general public instead of a legislator about it. So it's very interesting rules when it comes to ballot measures because they're actually considered lobbying, not falling under the same rules as supporting or opposing a candidate.
So Rhiannon, there's been a sort of a trend lately for foundations to adopt trust-based philanthropy approaches. So providing more general operating support, flexibility to our partners.
Mm-hmm.
When we do make general support grants to public charities that lobby pose a risk for foundations?
It actually provides more legal protections for foundations if you're doing general support grants, because you really aren't paying any attention to whether or not they're lobbying. You have a little bit less programmatic control, but you don't need to examine how much the organization you are granting is lobbying if you're doing general support grants. Unless you are potentially like their only funder. But assuming that organization has other funders and you are not the 99% of that organization's funding, then it really shouldn't matter to you how much lobbying they do because your funds won't be used for that.
All right, how are we looking on time, Carlos?
We are doing great, Mark. Thanks for asking. And one area, actually, a question I have is just kind of experiences in the field. Maybe this is a question to you, Mark. Kind of experience, obstacles, and places you've seen for opportunities.
I think there are plenty of opportunities out in the community. So I guess it always starts, I think for me, is listening to the partners and communities that we serve and not stepping into conversations with the prescribed notion of the outcomes and goals that you might be attuned to, that you want to sort of lay on the community and our partners. As I mentioned early at TCE, we really invested in building the capacity of not only residents, but our organizational partners as well. And so what we've come to find is there's sort of a thirst for leadership development, for skills building. And what we've done in the past is we've funded partners in leadership programs such as Urban Habitat, their boards and leadership commissions, as well as Rockwood Leadership Institute. And because we made it sort of in our strategic decision-making to fund more women-led, youth-led, BIPOC-led organizations, there's a lot of partners that just don't have the resources as well as the institutional skills to run nonprofits. So providing some of that leadership development, that coaching is really helpful, especially when you're talking about organizations working with immigrant and refugee communities, where there is such a high mistrust of government and not wanting to put yourself out in front of decision makers, to pull attention to yourself. And so I think it's really key to not only do leadership programs for community members, but really supporting the leaders that run nonprofit organizations that are these trusted messengers that communities really lean into in times of distress, or if there's something negative happening. And so, another note that I would like to make is, we've supported communities with developing, their own visions and goals. I mean, it takes time for folks to build trust with one another, to align their principles, to understand where folks are coming from and their shared commonalities that bring them together. And then and on top of that, we provided technical assistance around power analysis as well. So funding organizations like Scope out of LA to provide TA throughout the whole state of California, campaign development, healing retreats. Healing retreats are really big. I think there's a lot of trauma and hurt that communities carry with them. So addressing those issues as well. And then really investing in strategic planning retreats as well, bringing people together so they don't have to worry about, responding to an email or answering a phone call, but, really putting their focus into developing strategic plans that are really going to help their communities. And so again, all of those investments, has led to the sharpening of skills and strengthen the confidence of our communities to engage directly with decision makers on issues that have impacted or are very important to them. One loophole that I would like to share, and Rihanna, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is for those interested in education or school systems, that targeting school board members doesn't really fall under lobbying, and correct me if I'm wrong. But we funded our partners here in San Diego and throughout the state to improve school climate. And what that has looked like is addressing issues of willful defiance, suspensions and expulsions, issues around community resource officers being on campus, providing public testimonies, showing up at board meetings, silently protesting, and then engaging directly with board members. And everybody wants to see their child do well. I think schools are really important to a community. It's an opportunity to pull families out of poverty. And so, it would be hard not to find a parent that would be willing to engage with the school system to improve their child's academic success. And so that's always an easy sort of first foray into supporting advocacy work, because who doesn't want to support children and their education? But on that note, for those who are interested in supporting youth leadership engagement, youth organizing, please don't forget to provide support around transportation and refreshments. There's a lot you're sometimes asking of students and young people to get engaged. And they go to school, they're in class, 8 hours a day, and then having them, show up to a board meeting in the afternoon. It really takes a lot. So just keeping those things in mind and helping our partners worry less about certain things as they carry out their work. Hope that answers your question, Carlos.
No, it did. And one thing it makes me think about is you're talking about supporting the nonprofits and the work they do to build out their networks, but what are some supports that you as a funder find really helpful for develop out your network in this advocacy space? Like, I think Alliance for Justice is one that stands out to me, but I'd be curious to hear from you both as well.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier trust-based philanthropy. You know, before I joined the endowment and I worked at a nonprofit, there was something very intimidating and imposing when you're going to meet a funder in their building. So I always encourage my partners to meet our community where they're at, where our partners are at, going into the community, and just being you know, transparent and open. Don't make promises that you can't keep, and really ask those questions and really building the trust with our partners. I have found to be very has made my work much easier. I get a quicker response to partners now. There isn't this idea that I'm checking in to check up on them, but it's really checking in to see how they're doing, and understanding that the work that they carry is very difficult work, and not everybody does it. And there's a reason why the folks do the work that they do. Rhiannon, anything to add?
I did want to, at the very beginning of that, want to address you. You're correct. School boards are not considered legislators for the purposes of lobbying. And that is, there are some other things that are not considered legislators too. A school board is considered an administrative body. So school boards, sewer and water districts, housing authorities, any board or commission, zoning boards, Sandag, anything like that, they're not considered legislators. So you can actually talk to them about any piece of legislation that you want, and it's not considered lobbying. And that includes rulemaking bodies. So, you know, like the USDA, when they're publishing a new rule that's going to go into effect, you can submit comments on that, and that's not considered lobbying because those are not legislators. And also kind of trust-based, when it comes to funding advocacy, we talked about like determining the effectiveness of advocacy. I think it's really important as you're funding advocacy to be incredibly flexible, because advocacy is difficult to quantify. And a lot of it, especially if you are thinking about, you know, lobbying or building relationships, a lot of it is just building relationships with legislators and school boards and the community. And those may not be things that you can easily quantify, just like making it the goal of, I'm going to pass legislation that will do X, Y, and Z. Well, a lot of times it fails. And understanding that advocacy it may take you 3 or 4 years to get a version of a bill passed or to get your goal. It's not a, you know, one grant cycle thing. And the first year you may just be building relationships. So flexibility and coming up with, you know, unique and understanding ways to see what progress has been made is really important when it comes to funding advocacy. Oh, I see another question. Hold on, I've got to move my screen up to read the whole one. Oh, that's a great question. All right, the question in the chat that I see is, a lot of this conversation is making me realize funding advocacy is way less regulated than I initially thought. How can we break down that notion of, oh, we can't touch that, and generate buy-in at the board level to fund advocacy work? Oh, that is a great question. We could talk about that for the rest of the hour. I think having conversations frequently with your board will send you some great resources that you can share with your board about the legalities and what is and is not allowed. Because I think that's the first thing, is making sure your board understands what you can and cannot do. Giving them examples of advocacy that was effective, that was actually able to leverage philanthropy's dollars. And, you know, find, as you're making changes to your board and introducing new members of your board, bring in some people who have policy backgrounds and have advocacy. That's a great, you know, just one person who constantly wants to talk about advocacy on your board can make a huge difference. Start adding agenda items to your board meetings that have to do with policy that affects your issue areas, you know, whether it's just educating them and keeping them sort of thinking about policy and how policy affects your issue areas can be very helpful too. And, you know, start making recommendations for maybe potential small grants to organizations that do advocacy. But I think the more you talk about it, you can bring in speakers to talk about advocacy. You can bring in like Alliance for Justice, Boulder Advocacy to come in and give a presentation on the do's and don'ts. Bring in nonprofit, some of your grantees who do advocacy, bring them in and have them talk about it. Just the more you can talk about it and show the effectiveness, the more you're going to normalize it.
And we actually have time for Q&A, so I just want to give folks an opportunity. These have been great questions, but just inviting you all, if anything comes out that you're curious about as you think about how to make this, as Rhiannon said, normalized habit, and then also how to operationalize it. We'd love to chat and hear more.
Do you have any like reading materials or articles that kind of summarize or might give examples of like, what crosses the line, or, what kind of toes the line, just for reference? Because I know a lot of this kind of falls in gray area.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have a list of different stuff that we will send out to you after this, that we'll send to everybody.
All right, thank you.
Of course.
I'm curious, do we have any board members on today's session that can provide some perspective on what conversations are happening at the board level, or maybe some of the questions from peers, or maybe some of your own fears around advocacy and those issues that come up? I guess no board members.
So one thing that I can also recommend, and Mark can maybe talk about this a little bit too, one idea that you could potentially have is actually starting a policy and advocacy committee as one of your board committees. Mark is on the policy and advocacy committee for Catalyst, and they make recommendations to the board on policy and advocacy. So Mark, I don't know if you want to talk about the policy committee.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I sit on a lot of different, committees and council, but I must say the public policy committee at Catalyst is by far the most informative, insightful, and educational sort of experience I've had so far. And it's a collection of the larger Philanthropy California. So you've got the 3 affinity groups that make up Philanthropy California. You got Northern California Grantmakers, Southern California Grantmakers, and then Catalyst of San Diego and Imperial counties. And so what I've learned through this entire time, being that I'm from a private health foundation, is that there are a lot of, different policies that are being floated that do impact different aspects of philanthropy. And so I've learned more about donor advised funds. I've learned about, really different policies that might have an impact on our partners and the work that we're trying to fund. And so, every quarter I get to meet with Rhiannon, who comes up with an amazing agenda and provides us with amazing reading material that just, every time I read it, I feel like I'm much smarter, and my organization and my work is much better for it. But again, I think for me, what I've really gleaned the most from being part of the public policy committee is just the wealth of impact, not only on a national level, but on a statewide level as well. And then we go all the way down to our local level and engage with our partners to see how different policies are going to impact our field of philanthropy. And so I've met other folks on our committee that are doing amazing work, and we all come from different sort of sectors that are connected to philanthropy. And it's just a great learning environment for myself, who, if you asked me 2 years ago around public policy, I wouldn't have the faintest idea on telling you how its impact on philanthropy is happening. But since I've been part of this committee, it's just been amazing. And so my plug is, if you have some free time and you want to hang out with us, you're more than welcome to. And I guarantee you these are fun, insightful, educational meetings. Go ahead, Rhiannon. Take it home.
And yeah, we are always accepting members to our committee. They're members of Catalyst or some community members who are not members of Catalyst as well. And it's a great place to learn about different policies and get involved in policy, which you can then bring back to your own foundation and your own organization, and then potentially start your own policy committee at your own organization. And we'll send you out the information about the committee as well as a link to apply, or Carlos will just stick it right in there right now. So he just put that in the chat.
And would you say, Rhiannon and Mark, that this is the kind of thing that you can sort of just like learn by doing? Like it sounds a little scary to sort of just like jump onto a committee without having background knowledge, but it kind of sounds like maybe, Mark, that's a little bit of what you did. Would you recommend just diving in and getting our hands dirty?
Yeah, I mean, the community itself is very welcoming. There's a lot of very productive and constructive dialogue, especially around some of the policy positions that you know Catalyst that we recommend Catalyst to take. And so everybody's very open, and I think for me coming in with just no background in public policy, they really welcomed you with open arms, and you know, there's always room to ask questions. And again, the conversations have been very, very fruitful. And again, that's one of the reasons why this is one of my favorite committees to be part of until I term out. But hopefully that's a long ways away.
And there is a wide spectrum of policy experience on the committee. There are a few people who policy is their job. That's what they do for their organization. And there are, you know, all the way down to have never even thought about doing policy. This is sort of their very first, I am now going to try to do policy and advocacy, and I've never done it before. So it's this great, like, wide spectrum, which I think that's important, because I think people who have vast amounts of experience in policy are just as helped in the way that they think about policy, listening to people who don't have any experience, as the people who don't have any experience are listening to people who do have experience. It's such a nice exchange of different viewpoints and different ways of looking at the world.
And Rhiannon, can you talk a little bit about Foundation on the Hill and what's that's been like?
Sure. So Foundations on the Hill is a nationwide event from the United Philanthropy Forum. And every year in February or March, typically February, people from different United Philanthropy Forum member organizations and philanthropies and foundations travel to DC to participate in a bunch of really cool seminars and workshops on policy, and then go and meet with their House of Representatives members on the Hill and discuss different pieces of legislation. It's a really fantastic event. The last 2 years, we've done it virtually due to COVID, which was a really nice opportunity, something good that came out of it for people who were not able to travel to DC on a usual year to get involved. But it is a way to jump in and get involved. It's a great event where you learn about policy. Your leads for your area, which for San Diego is typically me, puts together all of the information and everything that you need to know, and you just have to read it and show up. And it's a great way of getting involved. We also do a similar event up in Sacramento every year in the spring, where same kind of thing. There's some workshops and information, and then we go meet with our state elected officials. And then as a policy committee, we also do some local visits as well throughout the year that you can participate in as a public policy member. So there's lots of great opportunities to sort of get your feet wet and get involved.
Thank you, Rhiannon. And just the last question for me is there anything pressing on the horizon right now in terms of public policy that will impact the field of philanthropy? I know that you're always plugged in and you've got your ears on the ground and you're just connected.
Sure. So I think in terms of public policy that will directly affect philanthropy, there are donor advised fund regulation bills that are popping up federally as well as all over the country. We see one or two of those bills pop up in the state legislature every year, and there's currently one that is at the federal level, the ACE Act, and these would impose additional regulations on donor advised funds and private foundations in general. And there is Catalyst has not taken a position on any of the DAF legislation, but we're doing a lot of education and trying to find out sort of what's going on. The only real position we've taken, which is not an actual position, is, and this is a great example of getting involved in policy without actually getting involved in a specific policy, is consistently talking to our legislators about how if they're going to legislate additional regulations on philanthropy, it sure would be nice if they reached out to philanthropy and talked to us about it and incorporated our views and our opinions instead of writing the legislation themselves and then coming to philanthropy. So that's sort of a great example of how you can talk to legislators about this without actually getting into the nitty-gritty policy itself. In terms of other legislation that is not necessarily philanthropy related, but that affects kind of all of the issues that we really care about. There's some very important voting rights legislation, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, that is coming up for a vote that Catalyst is, the policy committee has voted to support that. So lots of voting rights legislation on a federal level.
Thank you, Rhiannon. So we've got a few more minutes before we close, but are there any last minute pressing questions that you're just dying to ask?
I have a question, but I'm so glad you brought up DAFs. I'm filling out the survey right now, so I'm trying to multitask, and actually right before you started talking about that, I wrote that I would love to learn more about DAFs and public policy, especially with the recent scrutiny about using DAFs as kind of like a shield, for intent.
Paulina,
Sure,
I see an application submitted with your name on it, okay?
Oh, I'm almost done.
All right, well, if there aren't any other pressing questions, I want to turn it over to Carlos to close us out.
Thank you all. Thank you, Rhiannon. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone who participated in today's conversation. And before we do a closeout poll and closeout remarks, I actually just want to introduce someone who is joining us today. Kamal Martin, Catalyst's new VP, Vice President of Networks and Programs. Kamal comes to us with a commitment of transformational change in San Diego and Imperial counties. And I could provide an introduction for Kamal, but I would actually like to just invite him to speak briefly and with our staff here, or with our group here today, considering Kamal's background in advocacy.
Thanks for that, Carlos. Good morning, everybody. My name is Kamal Martin, and day one with Team Catalyst. My most recent position, I was with the California Charter School Association, and I was their Director of Advocacy in Southern California. Been in San Diego for a while. A lot of my background is in government, politics, kind of external affairs. Spent years as a staffer with the State Assembly, was the government relations person over at the Airport Authority for a while. And I do know a few of you, San Diego is a small place, at least a bit more than superficially, I'd like to say. I know I've crossed paths with Mark a couple of times, as well as Pauline. Mark had mentioned the Rockwood cohort. I went through that program maybe back in 2018. Just really, really happy to be here. Looking forward to learning with you all and supporting each other's work. That's all I got for today.
That's perfect, Kamal. You showed up and we appreciate it. I'm looking forward to building a stronger connection with you and just really reflecting as I think about the components that resonate with me today. First, I'll ask my colleague, Melissa, if you'd be kind enough to put the poll up for folks, and just if you can spend, if folks can please just fill it out, and I'll just kind of share some reflections. But the thing that stood out to me is the power of knowledge in order to be able to move through uncertainty. I think advocacy, there might be a lot of misconceptions, and really just demystifying that by having conversations with your peers, with your boards, looking up information, and just allowing that to be a part of the process of the work that we do. Because I know that a lot of people, I would assume everyone here is on this call because of the direct service needs that you support, but also recognizing the value of looking upstream is something that I am really taking into the lens of following today's session. So just echo again my note of gratitude to everyone who joined us here today. And we look forward to keeping in touch with you and also with Kamal. Thank you all and have a beautiful day.